I'm going to finish up my commentary on Christopher Lasch's Revolt of the Elites tonight. I'll be discussing the third part. It's called The Dark Night of the Soul. This part is primarily about the role of religion under the neoliberal order. First of all, just a reminder of why we're doing this. On this channel, we've looked at a few thinkers who are highly critical of liberalism or neoliberalism, who look at that as an ideology and one that has, to a certain extent, warped human nature and been detrimental to the development of society. For instance, I've done a series on Jacques Ellul's Technological Society and Chris Hedges' The Death of the Liberal Class. Chris Lasch provides probably the best critique so far of the neoliberal order, and he spends more than you might think on the spiritual dimension of the problem. But just as kind of a preview, I'm pretty soon going to be covering the book by Patrick Deneen, Why Liberalism Failed, which came out in hardcover just this year. In a lot of ways, Deneen takes up where Lasch leaves off and really puts things together well. So for better or worse, you have that to look forward to. The third part of Lasch's book, though, is entitled The Dark Night of the Soul, and of course that alludes back to the poem by the same name by St. John of the Cross, who was a 16th century theologian, philosopher, who went on to write much more about this notion of what it takes to reach a true knowledge and relationship of God, and the spiritual crisis, the sort of crisis in the darkness that people experience as they seek for God, and which hopefully culminates in knowledge of God. And he evokes this title, The Dark Night of the Soul, in his discussion of the role of religion in the liberal order. So the suggestion is that we are experiencing a sort of spiritual crisis, that this is a dark night. That the soul is struggling to find something higher and greater than itself, than it is able to achieve in the times in which we live. Lasch goes on in the first chapter in this part, entitled The Abolition of Shame, to criticize how shame has become, in a sense, a dirty word, a word that should be outlawed, and it has been seen in this light by the new therapeutic culture of the elites. The elites, he says, have taken on this notion that more or less people's sense of shame, which reflects their sense of right and wrong, is a sort of mental defect or illness of sorts, a sort of low-level mental problem that needs to be cured through positive thinking, through therapy, to realize that for the most part you're repressed. I think I might have mentioned before that Lasch is simultaneously informed by Freudian psychology, but also fairly critical of it and its ramifications for our culture. He says the only thing forbidden in our culture of exposure is the inclination to forbid, to set limits on disclosure. In other words, the only thing that's forbidden is to basically want to suppress or control oneself. He says the therapeutic discovery of shame finds its political expression in remedial programs administered by caretakers professing to speak on behalf of the downtrodden, but concerned above all to expand their professional jurisdiction. Here we get back to the theme of the revolt of the elites, how the elites have drawn away from the masses into their own world. They see themselves, he's saying here, as a sort of professional class that can bring psychological health and happiness to all people. And so their approach is to use the political system, to use society generally, to create ideas and programs that will make people better. The suggestion there is that the therapist, the professional crisis manager, knows better than you do about how to handle a situation. So think about how in any given crisis we're likely to encounter paid therapists to come and sort of help us deal with whatever the thing is. The thing that shouldn't have happened to begin with, by the way, but the thing that now you have to cope with through the help of a professional. I forget where this come from, but maybe Saturday Night Live, with this line, "Hello, we're here to help you," right? Does anybody remember what that comes from? "We're here to help you," expresses a lot of where Lasch is coming from here. It may seem nice to constantly be helped, but to flip it around, and the suggestion is that we don't have the basic ingredients within ourselves, and not all of us do, but maybe a lot more of us do than we think, that we don't have the basic ingredients in ourselves to handle a crisis. But somehow other people do, simply because they have a different type of training or education than we do. So here he is, again, talking about there's two types of people. And in this case, you have the professional caretakers. I mean, more than just therapists, but all these folks that have been supposedly trained and able to help us to deal not only with crises, but with our own sense of shame and instinct to sort of limit ourselves. The worst thing in the world would be to say, no, I shouldn't do that, even though I feel like doing it. They're here to help us feel good about going ahead and doing it. So then he brings in this notion that religion might do a better job than psychology at dealing with people's impulses. He says, at best, psychoanalytic theory exposes the moral and existential dimension of mental conflict, but even then it cannot compete with religion. Maybe religion is the answer after all. It is not at all clear, at any rate, that religion could do much worse. So he disapproves of the shamelessness and the sort of license that this therapeutic culture of the elites has wrought, and he's actually making bold to say that religion and its approach to sort of managing people's mental and physical behavior might be a more healthy option. So that gives us a taste as where he's going to head. The 12th chapter is entitled Philip Rieff and the Religion of Culture, but it actually doesn't matter too much to know who Philip Rieff is in particular. This chapter goes on into the area of the social and psychological implications and political implications of sort of this therapeutic culture. He worries, quote, whether a democratic society can flourish or even survive in the absence of the internal constraints that formerly supported the work ethic and discouraged self-indulgence, end quote. Well, as liberalism unfolded and we got further and further away from its beginnings, the institutions that were there alongside it, but were not created by it, namely religion, family, society, culture, all of these other things, eroded in their exposure to liberalism. When he says, in the absence of the internal constraints that formerly supported the work ethic, he's saying that those institutions that were alongside liberalism, eroded by liberalism, were no longer there to kind of restrain the worst tendencies of the liberal order. So, for instance, without a strong sort of moral prohibition against leaving one's spouse for another, backed up by religion and all of the fears, as well as the goals, the positive goals that might be put out for people to live a good life of self-control. Without that belief in place, it's more likely that people will go their separate ways. Without a strong moral prohibition against lying, you will get more lying and more cheating, both in personal matters and in the economy. but he's simply saying that it's kind of a truism at this point that the founders, for instance, more or less expected that people's religion and sort of organic morality that grew up around the family would continue to be pretty strong without any sort of political or larger support beyond the individual and the individual's own little social networks. And it took a while for that to erode, but it did erode for a variety of reasons. And liberalism, that is, both individualism, the rights mentality, the profit motive, all of those things become a little bit unhinged and a little bit unrestrained, a lot unrestrained, without those countervailing, more traditional forces to hold them back. In other words, those two things don't go naturally together, but they've been going together for a while, and now one is dwindling and the other is thriving. And the therapeutic mentality is kind of like the nail in the coffin of the self-control that used to be elicited by the religious mentality, which is all about more or less honor and shame. He says, "It is not enough to note that religious enthusiasm has declined. It is also necessary to ask what has taken its place. The vacuum left by secularization has been filled by a permissive culture that replaces the concept of sin with the concept of sickness." See, sin can only be cured by some transcendent being in a connection with that being. Sickness, on the other hand, can be cured by us through therapy or through, drugs or a combination thereof. He then goes on to talk about how the therapeutic mentality paved the way for the managerial state. The state sort of steps in both with its actual therapy and with all of its other programs to help us not only in our physical needs, but also in our, psychological, emotional, economic, this and that needs, all of which at this point, because, it goes hand in hand with a diminishing ability for people to be able to deal with life on their own and to truly help themselves, because of not only the actual encroachment of the state, but also of the economic changes that we've already talked about, that leave people very vulnerable and dependent upon the overall economy. Our ability to help ourselves continues to decline. Our ability to reach out to others, to create networks of help and mutual dependency or interdependency continue to erode. So weirdly, the message of the state relative to the people is one of we need to take care of you. This is through, all of the various programs and subsidies and regulations and so on and so forth. But at the same time, the message from the very same state is one of self-reliance and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and individual responsibility. It's a weird schizophrenia that leaves all of us pretty dependent in one way or the other and feeling pretty responsible for our dependency at the same time, but not having the tools any longer to really be able to help ourselves, because self-help is not about the individual pulling himself up by his bootstraps as though he could do that all by himself, but used to be the help of an entire community of people, starting with your own family, your extended family, and then the other people around you. That's the kind of self-help that the state and the economy continue to erode. He ends this chapter with some discussion of how this therapeutic approach was launched with the idea that human beings could finally overcome all of their problems and more or less be like gods. It's part of the Enlightenment project, the idea that we're held back by superstitions and by, sort of like irrational feelings of shame and limits when we should have no limits. However, what this has led to has not really been godlike for the most part for most individuals, but has rather been dependency, a combination of license and dependency. License to kind of wallow in one's, wants and desires to the extent one can, and dependency both on the state and on the market. The final chapter is The Soul of Man Under Secularism. He starts off by saying the postmodern mood is one of disillusionment with grand historical theories or meta-narratives, and by an aesthetic revolt against middle-class culture. The first would have anything to do with a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Anything from Judeo-Christianity all the way to Marxism, the three great ideologies of the 20th century: liberalism, communism, fascism. So disillusionment with those narratives that speak to some sort of universal truth, historical progress, and so on. And then disillusionment also against the middle class culture, which is part and parcel with that because it tends to embrace this notion of a truth, of a sort of something solid. And the postmodern mentality doesn't see anything solid left. Everything is questioned. He says the disenchantment of the world made it, quote, flat, uninspiring, and unhappy. It deprived men and women of the experience of ecstasy, literally the trance-like state of being beside oneself, more broadly a state of overmastering feeling as of rapture. He's getting into the territory that Charles Taylor has covered with this notion of disenchantment, the idea that it is not possible for most people to have an experience of transcendence such as they had before in religious experience, because there is no more the ability to latch on to something higher and greater than themselves, beyond even the meta-narrative, to true transcendence in some sort of God. So first we have the distancing and break with the morality, the sort of honor-shame morality of religion, and then introducing the postmodern mentality, we have a true disengagement with the transcendent itself, an inability to believe in anything, probably caused by the so-called meta-narratives that actually came about to kind of replace the Judeo-Christian meta-narrative. The ideological meta-narratives were worldly, and really, in hindsight, look like secular religious replacements for earlier so-called superstitious religions. At the end of all that, you have this disenchantment and an inability to recapture this notion or the experience of ecstasy or rapture, the inability to actually experience the religious state. But he says there's one faith that remains, and that is the faith in science. Now, he was writing in the 90s, and I dare say that times have changed a bit, and there are fewer people who have this complete and overwhelming faith in the progressive nature of science and the goodness of science. For better or worse, we have a situation in which we, on the one hand, are being told that the climate is changing due to man-made conditions, and we have proposals being made actually to use more science to engineer the atmosphere to reduce the sun's heat, warming effect on the planet. Perhaps the reason why that hasn't been implemented yet, ironically, is because there are so many people who don't believe in the scientific validity of global warming. and they don't believe in it because they've experienced so many cases where science either has been wrong or it's led to things that have caused more environmental problems. Anyway, he says, those wonderful machines that science has enabled us to construct have not eliminated drudgery, but they have made it possible to imagine ourselves as masters of our fate. In an age that fancies itself as disillusioned, this is the one illusion of mastery that remains as tenacious as ever. But now that we are beginning to grasp the limits of our control over the natural world, it is an illusion, the future of which is very much in doubt, an illusion more problematical, certainly, than the future of religion. I suppose Lasch thinks that religion ultimately has more staying power than the faith in science because it acknowledges the lack of godlike control over the world, since it relinquishes that control to God. It's almost like he's saying, God doesn't look too crazy right now compared to everything else we might believe in. Of course, that elicits a whole series of questions. What is God? How do you relate to God? What the heck does God mean in this type of a world? And so on and so forth. But Lasch doesn't attempt to answer those questions. That's not what he's about. He's much more into critique than he is into solutions, but those critiques are pretty valuable and eye-opening. And I hope that you've enjoyed this brief introduction to Christopher Lasch and his book, The Revolt of the Elites.